Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to Transition to Adult Life Part 4. This presentation is called Getting and Keeping the First Job, and it's all about employment. I am Beth Reel. I'm the Transition Coordinator and Youth Advisory Board Coordinator for the Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. And this is the fourth in our Transition to Adult Life series. So as usual, for those of you who have been on before, or for those of you who have not, I'm going to have everybody hold questions to the end. So you are welcome to type them into the Q&A or the chat box, or if you're on Facebook Live, you can comment, and I will go through those at the end of the presentation because we have a lot of content to cover as we're going through. So to stop for questions would just interrupt the flow of the presentation. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end, however. So let's get started. So this presentation is adapted from a curriculum that was created quite a while back by the Pacer Center. If you have not visited their website, they have an extensive and wonderful collection of information around transition to employment, transition to college. So go ahead and check them out when you have a chance. So today we're going to talk about what students and families need to know about employment. We'll talk briefly about accommodations, disclosure, and interviewing, a little bit about from what the employers are looking for, self-employment, and then we'll have some time for questions. As always, webinar is a short snippet of information. Transition to employment is a huge topic, an extensive topic. So we're really going to just touch on some, I guess, important points, things that families and students really need to know as they start off on this journey. So just taking a look at some employment statistics, people with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, and that's from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And as I went back and looked to update this presentation so I could get the latest statistics that were available, I found that this number really has not changed. No matter how many more people are employed, and we do have a number of people with disabilities who are employed that wouldn't be employed at one time. But this difference, this 2.5 times more likely to be unemployed, has not changed since I think this presentation was created in 2010. So we still have a ways to go in this area. And then the indicators of success that came out of a study called the National Longitudinal Transition Study number 2 talks about work experience while students are in school and post-secondary education, and then family involvement as ways to help students to be most successful. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that study, it's actually quite fascinating when we talk about indicators of success. So why is work important? And I frame this question for all of us. So we're not just talking about for people with disabilities, we're talking about for all people. If you've ever had a period of time where you've been out of work, or maybe you know, had to be either out on leave or unemployed or whatever, you'll know how not having that place to go and something to do has an impact on your daily living, on your mental health. You know, especially if it's an unemployment situation and you really want to work, it can be quite impactful. So employment and working and contributing to society helps us to feel better about ourselves and helps us to feel connected. So You know, these are, again, just some of the reasons why. You know, I focus a lot when I'm working with families and students on, you know, okay, so how can we get students, you know, out of the house so they're not feeling alone, they're not feeling isolated. You know, their phone or their computer or their video game or the remote to the TV is not what they spend the most time with. And I think that is happening for a lot of students, and you know, that's why we do what we do, because we're trying to you know, help change that situation. So what we're seeing today has, again, not changed much from the time this presentation was created. So youth are struggling to find jobs, not just youth with disabilities, but youth with disabilities, of course, given the information on that first slide, are having a much more difficult time. The jobs that are available perhaps don't meet their strengths and their interests. So that's, you know, when when students are in high school and we're working on strengths and understanding strengths and interests, that's where this piece comes in. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Youth staying at home and just waiting for the services to happen, waiting for the services to come to them. And youth not willing or able to disclose their disability. All of these things we're going to touch on a little bit more. So in today's labor market, there is, and there has been for quite a while, a strong competition for entry-level jobs. So as the unemployment rates rose, we were seeing people in entry-level jobs that, you know, had higher levels of education because they were just taking something that would pay the bills or help them to possibly pay the bills. Employers, that should say, employees are expected to be cross-trained, sorry. So no longer do we have, when you go into the doctor's office, that person that is just responsible for greeting you and taking your name. Now that person is greeting people as they come in, entering information into the computer, entering insurance information, taking phone calls, giving that information to the next person in line. So jobs are not just you know, a single job, or as they maybe once were. We're expected to do a lot more. We're sometimes juggling several jobs, and that can be challenging for people with disabilities. Summer months when students come home can be very difficult to find a job. Interpersonal skills are important in most jobs, and worker shortage, we're already starting to see it. So as baby boomers age out and start to, or they have been retiring, there is a worker shortage. What we're seeing though, it is those higher level jobs. So jobs that people need, I should say, higher level of education. So they're not the entry level jobs that we're talking about when we're talking about what the first job would be for someone. So we're going to go through all of these pieces of what families and students need to know. So it really begins with self-awareness. I say this to people all the time. Self-advocacy and self-awareness are two of the biggest reasons why people are not successful. That goes for employment, and that goes for post-secondary education as well. So if a person does not understand their disability, if they don't understand their strengths, if they don't understand their challenges, if they're not able to, we're going to talk about disclosure in a couple slides from now, but if they're not able to talk to someone else that they don't know very well about their disability, then it's a major challenge for them as they move into the adult world. It's so important, it's so critical that they know, because employers and colleges don't want to talk to parents and family members. It's not appropriate for the most part for mom and dad to call an employer and talk about a challenge. It is important for the employee, the student, to do that on their own. And so this is an area where it falls apart very quickly if they can't explain to an employer what they need. And so same thing, self-advocacy. We all have to be self-advocates, every single one of us. So this is a term that we use frequently in the disability world, but if you think about it, if you get the wrong dish at a restaurant and you ask somebody to send it back, if you ask the waiter or waitress, server to send it back, you are advocating for yourself. You are a self-advocate. If something's not working for you in your workplace and you go to your employer and you ask them to change something, you're advocating for yourself. And so it's no different for students with disabilities. And I think that's one of the things that we as family members and as service providers often forget, that we think that the world of employment is different for people with disabilities. And sometimes it is different when a person needs a support person or needs a service provider. And this presentation is very general, so we're talking about general situations. There are a variety of different ways that people enter into employment. And at the same time, how can that person advocate for themselves to the greatest extent possible? So, so self-advocacy is critical. That's a whole presentation. It's many presentations actually on how to do that. But for students and families, it's about letting students take on that role, letting students step forward, providing that support for them. So when they're having a challenge, they can come home and they can brainstorm with you, and then they can go back and ask the questions that are necessary. And so often starting this in school is the best place. So student comes home, they're having a problem with the teacher, or they don't understand something. And as parents, we're so quick to jump in and call that teacher, email that teacher, text that teacher. But are we really helping them? Maybe taking a step back and coaching them to take those steps and talk with that teacher and not just jump in. That can translate into being able to go into employment situations and be much more successful. So career planning is what we do in school when we're doing transition planning in a way. So we're talking about, okay, what jobs are you interested in? What are the requirements of that job? What kind of education do you need? Is it inside, outside? Do you like to work outside? Do you want to be inside all day? What times of day? If you're not a morning person and you have to be at a job at 7 a.m., that might not be the right fit for you. That being said, sometimes entry-level jobs, the schedule requires that. And so how can you plan for that? How can you work with that? And so this is where assessments come in when students are in school. Okay, so why do we do career planning? We really want to help match a job with a student or young adult. And so I often use the example of a student that I was talking with that just wanted to work at Dunkin' because they love Dunkin' coffee and they love Dunkin' Donuts. And they thought that was the greatest thing ever, that they, would get to do that. And so we talked about the speed that's required to get people their coffee in the morning. So you have a bunch of people that haven't had their coffee yet. They might be a little grumpy, and you want to get them their coffee as soon as humanly possible. Well, that student was a person with a processing disorder. So it took him time he certainly could do the job, but it took him time to think about what he needed to do next, what the next step would be, all of the steps of the job. And so what he discovered was that Dunkin' or like a fast food restaurant was probably not a good placement for him, because he just didn't have the capacity to work at that pace. And so he decided that he could just enjoy Dunkin' coffee and donuts and perhaps work someplace else. So we need to look at things like that. We need to look at all of this in transition planning through the IEP. Are we planning appropriately for this student? Are we taking their strengths into account? Are we taking their interests and their needs and challenges into account? And then that's where we start to see what is realistic. You know, or if you want to be a doctor but you're exempt from science courses because your the science curriculum is too much, or you're taking it at a slower pace, which is really what I hope we're doing at this point. You know, perhaps being a doctor is not the right place. And so there's a link down at the bottom. It's for a website for an assessment called ONET. It's O and then NET. So if you can't see it, I'll just read the link to you. It's www.onetonline.org. So it's onetonline.org. So that's a great assessment for anyone, really. I've taken it a few times myself to see if I'm in the right career or not. I think I am. Service career for me, for sure. But I've used it with several students. I've used it with my own children to just see what I'm looking at actually aligning with my interests. And so if you didn't get that link, I'm going to, when I post this on the CPAC website, I will post all of those links, all of the links throughout the presentation as well, just so you'll have it. Okay, so how can families help? So when we look at that National Longitudinal Transition Study that I spoke about earlier, positive family involvement is a really big piece. And so frequently when I'm speaking with families and they're like, I'm not doing enough, I have so much to do, you know, am I actually helping? You know, I hear what families are doing for their students, for their kids, for the young adults that they're supporting, and just the fact that they're involved makes an impact. It doesn't say, you know, the highest level of involvement. It just says you're involved, you're there, you're supportive. That makes a huge difference for really any student. We're not really necessarily, we are talking about students with disabilities, but this is across the board. Students are much more successful when they have supportive adults and families in their lives. And so sometimes that's parents, sometimes that's a family member, sometimes that's a close family friend. But just believing in them, maintaining those high expectations, you know, thinking, okay, they can do this, they can be successful, they can try out some different workplaces. So that really starts at home. That starts at a young age with those soft skills, making decisions, being able to make choices. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but from the time kids are really little, we can ask them questions like, what cereal do you want today? You know, give them two choices. What pants do you want to wear today? Give them two choices. And as kids get older, expect them to do things, expect them to do chores, expect them to contribute to the family. You know, I had a service provider say to me with my son when he was in 8th grade, why is he not doing his own laundry? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So all of those things help you understand that you're a part of something and that you can contribute. So there's lots of things in the study that that families can do, and there is a document called the Guideposts for Success that I actually did not share on here that I meant to. So I'm going to write that down to add that. So that when I post this, I will also post the guidepost, because that has a lot of ideas for things that families can do to help support students and youth. So using personal networks. So if you think back to all the different ways that you may have gotten your job that you have now or your first job, it may not have been the traditional route. So it may not have been going into a store and filling out an application. It may have been, you know, somebody told your mom or your dad that they had an opening. And so I think we underestimate the value of our personal networks when we are thinking about our students with disabilities. And so talking with people that you know, saying, you know, this person is looking for an employment opportunity, or even just to go in and shadow something that they might be interested in. So just think about the network that you have and the network that people you know. So you have a network, and then the people you know have a network. Excuse me. And then you also perhaps bringing that to, so the fourth bullet point says, tell service providers such as vocational rehabilitation about them. And so in our state, the Bureau of Rehab Services, or the Bureau of Education and Services for the Blind, are our vocational rehabilitation providers. And so one of the things that they talk about in a document that they put out called In the Meantime is thinking about and using your personal networks. And then if you find something, BRS could perhaps support that student or that young adult in that job if the employer is willing to work with them. And there are some benefits for employers as well if they hire people that are working through the vocational rehabilitation system. And so I will again post that document in the meantime. It's a little bit outdated because it talks about looking for jobs in newspapers, and I'm not sure that very many people are doing that anymore, but I know that it's up actually for an update, and the basic information is still good. So looking at a resume for students that are going into work in a more traditional route, applying for a job online, they're going to have to upload a cover letter and a resume. This isn't any different than anybody who's going to apply for a job. So, so there are service providers when you're working with vocational rehabilitation that can help to support somebody as they're creating a resume. And the Department of Labor link that I have at the bottom talks about things that job seekers need to know, and resume is one of them, one piece of that. So when we're thinking about a resume, you know, a lot of people will say, well, I don't have any job experience. And it's really a matter of being thoughtful and creative about what experience they do have that translates into a skill that an employer might look for. So perhaps they don't have that, you know, experience going and working in, you know, local grocery store or Dunkin' Donuts or something like that. But maybe they helped out in their catechism class. Maybe they supported younger students in a preschool class in high school. Maybe they volunteered because they love animals and they volunteered for a pet shelter or a veterinarian, or you know, what have you. Maybe their family worked with food share every year. You know, there are a lot of different things that students do that they actually learn work skills, but they you know, are not actual paid employment. So thinking sort of outside of the box, you know, did they do something even within school? So perhaps they, you know, were in a club in school, or you know, took on a leadership position in some program at school. So all of those things translate to skills that they could put on their resume. So working with somebody who's able to ask those questions, there are some websites online that go through questions like that when you're creating a resume. So, that's an easy Google search to find something like that. Okay. So as I just said, volunteering, especially when they're in between school and work, or even when they're in work, a lot of times schools are not able to connect students with paid employment, and so they're going out and they're volunteering. I know a lot of students work in the food pantry and homeless shelter in my area. Other students work in hospitals doing different things. So it is a place to learn skills, and it's something to do, when we're talking about, like, in the meantime, what do you do while you are waiting for maybe services from BRS to start up? So going out and trying different things. It can be a great way to experiment and think, okay, I love animals. Maybe I want to go work in a veterinarian hospital. And then, they get there and they find out that they actually don't like the mess that's involved in that. So these are all good reasons to volunteer. And then they can provide perhaps references. And there are definitely volunteer opportunities that lead to jobs for students. It's a way for an employer to see, who they are and what skills they bring to the table. So all of those reasons for volunteering. And then the 211 website, I believe you can search volunteer opportunities. So it's 211ct.org. For people looking for volunteer opportunities. But don't forget about even local places like your town hall and your local service agencies to look for places that students can volunteer. So disability disclosure is a really big topic. And this is why we want students to have an understanding of their disability and to be able to describe what they need, how they learn in specific situations. That being said, they are not required to disclose. So here is where this big change happens from, a student in school perhaps doing jobs within the school or going out and doing volunteer work with the school. It's understood that that person has a disability and the employer may not know what it is, but the student doesn't really have to do a whole lot around disclosure. So when a student exits services from a school district and moves into the adult world, the law completely changes. So we go from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so it is different in the way that they access accommodations and the supports that they need. So first, they need to know it's a personal choice. They do not have to disclose their disability. They don't have to answer questions in an interview. So working with students on these pieces are, again, it's another part of the transition process that's really important, because many people do not know the law, and they do not know that they cannot ask somebody if they have a disability in an interview. I would hope that more people than not, especially if they are the interviewer, but you just never know what's going to happen in an interview. So a really good resource that I suggest is the 411 on disability disclosure. And that's from the National Center for Work and Disability, I think it is, NCWD, and it's the youth section. So the 411 on disability disclosure has, a ton of information. There's a lot of videos online. This is a big topic. The choices, it's not an easy area to navigate for a person with a disability, because there are so many scenarios that happen when they go into a workplace. So just so they know that they're not required to do that. That being said, if they want accommodations, they do need to disclose their disability. And so then working with them on who do you talk to, what person would be the appropriate person to go to disclose information about your disability. And so the thing to know about Americans with Disabilities Act and employment is the person must be able to do the job. The accommodations just help them to get there. And so when we think about things like a person who uses a wheelchair, so they can do the job, but they need a ramp or a support to be able to get into the building, or they may need a desk or a table that moves up and down so that they can access the computer at the level that they need the computer to be at. So they can do whatever that job is. They have the education or they have the experience to do that job, but they need these accommodations. They need these supports. A person who is blind or visually impaired, having a screen reader, or having software that reads information to them. So again, they can do the job. They just need these accommodations to help them. And so that gets a little confusing when, again, we go from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in schools where, yes, we are providing accommodations for a person, but we also may be modifying things for a person with a IEP. And it's very different when you go out and you start to navigate the adult world. And the IEP isn't always, it's usually not applicable in the employment setting. Now, if a student is working with BRS, the Bureau of Rehab Services, or the Department of Developmental Services, they may be using that as a piece of information. But knowing the differences between IDEA and ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, can save a lot of time and trouble. And so again, it's not just for the families to know, but for the students to know, for the students to understand what the law is and what the protections are that support them. So around job accommodations, I just listed a few, but Jan has a fantastic website. So it's www.askjan.org. They have all kinds of information about the Americans with Disabilities Act and accommodations. They have supports for employers. So if employers are looking for information, and then some other local supports that we have around assistive technology would be the Connecticut Tech Act program at cttechact.com, and then the NEAT Center at Oak Hill. And again, I will post all of these links. I know it might be hard to see them for the participants in the webinar. So the interview process, having students practice with someone in the school, so doing mock interviews, and then I suggest taking that a step further and having them practice with somebody they do not know. So perhaps there's somebody within the school that they do not know that you can ask to work with a student, or do an interview with a student. Or maybe there is a service provider that that the school staff works with that can do a mock interview with a student. Because it's one thing for a student to be interviewed by their teacher, who they perhaps have known for a very long time and are very comfortable with. And it's quite another thing. I often talk about how students will come into the CPAC offices with their families, and we will direct questions to the student, and a couple of things happen, but often the student cannot interact with us, strangers that they do not know. And if they're going out and, going the traditional route of employment, that's going to be a problem for them. So then the other piece of that is mom or dad jump in. So, at this point in time, and what we're talking about, I'm always encouraging parents to take a step back. And it's hard. I'm the parent of a young man with a disability as well. And letting go and stepping back and supporting them is not what we have done throughout their entire school career. And so it does take some time and baby steps. So, working with them on the fact that they do not have to disclose their disability in the job interview, helping them to understand if somebody asks them a question related to their disability, what would be an appropriate response? So troubleshooting as many situations as you possibly can. And if you're looking for interview questions, standard interview questions, there's no shortage of them online. So that would be my suggestion, to go through a lot of different types of questions that you can find online, getting students as prepared as possible. And there are times when service providers and family members are allowed into interviews. And there are times when that is appropriate. And we need to think about that, and we need to think about whether it is appropriate for this person to go into an interview on their own, as scary as that might be for family members. I've lived through that. It's an amazing learning experience for a young adult. As challenging as it is for family members to sit back and not know what's going to happen, there's a lot to learn about going and sitting in an interview on your own. And as family members and as service providers, we also need to think about the fact that this person is going out and working without us. So, there are situations, again, where they will have a service provider, a job coach that will be with them. But if that's not the case for the person that you're working with or thinking about, then we need to think long and hard about how we're supporting them. I remember the husband of one of my coworkers saying that he had hired this young man who was having trouble getting out of bed, and he got some warnings because he was late. And next thing he knows, mom's calling and yelling at him and making excuses for him being late. And that is not appropriate. That is not going to keep this young man from getting fired. If he had a disability, perhaps, he may or may not have, I don't know. But these are things that are not appropriate. So if you think about, would you have wanted your parent to call your first employer, and whether that would have been appropriate? Even now, do you want your family member or even your spouse to, significant other, to call your employer? So all of that just to say, we need to be thoughtful about what we're doing and how we're preparing students. But these are some of the very real scenarios that we are seeing. And the people that I know that are employers are telling me that parents are, very, very, some parents are very far reaching, and they're reaching just way too far. Again, sometimes it's appropriate. So that's really what we need to go back to, is what is appropriate for that individual. Okay, so from the employer's perspective, and the employers that I've spoken with and worked with, and all the presentations that I have been to that have included employers, they, without hesitation, say, there are most people we can teach the necessary requirements for the job. that if they're, if it's an appropriate position for them, if they're qualified for it. But there are other things that they can't teach, and these are the things that get people into challenging situations and unfortunately get people fired. So having a positive attitude, that is a big piece. When you think about where you work or places that you have worked in the past, and you have people that come to work, we're not always all, sunshine and roses about going to work, work is work, but generally people, that come in, say good morning, smile, interact, and have a good attitude, help make the workplace a more positive place to be. And I'm sure most of us can think about a time when we worked with somebody that was, always down in the dumps, didn't bring a positive attitude to the workplace. And so it makes a difference. And if, employer is looking to lay people off, needing to lay people off, who are they going to, lay off first? The people that come in and enhance the workplace, or the people that are negative and bring the workplace down. So being honest, being punctual is, I've heard more and more people being fired lately, young adults being fired lately for not being on time. It's challenging and it's important. Being able to communicate. So that is another one that goes back to the disclosure, whether or not they're going to talk about their disability, or even just saying, I might need to do something a little bit different as an accommodation, and understanding that sometimes, they really need to make that step, that the employer is not going to necessarily always come to them and offer something. Having appropriate behavior, being reliable. When a person is assigned a job, they're expected to do that job, and they're expected to complete that job and ask questions if they need help. So that's something else we can instill in our students is, okay, instead of, sitting there and not doing the job because you don't know how to do part of it, asking a question, asking the employer, and then being able to accept criticism. And I don't mean negative criticism in the sense of, somebody just being mean, but positive feedback. So when they go into the review process and their employer says, these are the things that you can improve on, having them understand that that is constructive criticism, and that is a support in an area that they can work on, but also noticing that they have strengths, and that there are areas that they are doing a really good job. And then, of course, willingness to learn new things. So self-employment is an area that is really growing for people with disabilities. It allows a lot of flexibility at times, good for certain areas of the state, good for people that have specific interests. And at the same time, self-employment requires a lot of being able to juggle multiple things at one time, and a level of organization. So if you know of somebody who might be interested in that, the Department of Labor, Office of Disability, I can't remember what ODEP stands for, I'm blanking on it, but ODEP has a lot of information about self-employment and has a lot of resources. I believe that there may be some funding for this, if I'm not mistaken. At one point there was, and funding being what it is, it comes and goes. But that's a place to look. That's a place to start for somebody who may be interested in self-employment. And it's, you know, it really is becoming more and more, I'm seeing it more and more frequently. So we talked a lot about what to do, how to prepare for getting a job, preparing for the interview. And then there's this other piece of actually keeping the job. And so we certainly talked about many different strategies when a person is employed. So showing up is one of those things. Showing up on time, showing up when you're supposed to. You know, basic critical skill. Working well with others, being flexible to changes that might happen in the workplace, and then what can families do? So building support systems that a student may need. So if they struggle, if they end up struggling in their employment setting, what resources do they have? If they're working with the Department of Developmental Services or the Bureau of Rehab Services, are there supports within those programs that can help them with a struggle that they may be having at work? Having regular communication. So again, as parents, we can't, you know, call the employer and, you know, make excuses for our kids and things like that. But we certainly can check in with them when they come home from work. Hey, how did it go today? How was work? You know, asking them, you know, if we know that they've been having a specific challenge, asking them about it, maybe providing some suggestions to them. If your young adult is not receptive to you as a parent, because sometimes we are the parents and they don't want to listen to us because they don't think we know anything, then finding somebody else that they may be able to talk with. So a counselor at school can be really helpful. Teacher, a family friend. You know, there are a lot of different people that may be in that person's network that can provide that support. If they're no longer in school, perhaps a therapist or counselor or mentor. So different people that can help that person navigate the employment setting. And sometimes it just doesn't work. So that's hard as parents because we just want to see our children achieving success. And we've worked really hard, they've worked really hard, and when it doesn't work out, it can be really frustrating. And those are incredible learning opportunities. Why didn't it work out? What can we learn from this? What can we do different next time? So that comes for anything. That goes for anything that doesn't work out. Might not just be an employment situation. So looking at the reasons why it doesn't work out, and not necessarily, you know, not blaming the person, but just trying to help them so that they know what happened. And how to perhaps navigate the situation in a different way. Okay, so so practicing filling out job applications, we're in a very different world than we were, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. It's rare that there are paper applications, though there are times. One of my nephews was just talking about filling out a paper application the other day. And I was really surprised by that because I thought everyone had gone online. But understanding that the application systems are much more challenging, they present barriers for people that don't process quickly because many times they're timed. Our transition symposium in the fall, we usually have a presentation from someone at the Department of Labor who talks about these applicant tracking systems and how much things have changed. So those are some considerations. Thinking about transportation, we have more options than we did at one time, and yet they can be quite expensive, but there can be some money through some of the federal programs, and there are counselors, there are through the Bureau of Rehab Services that can help people navigate through that and understand what is available to them. Disability management, and again, sometimes it might be hiring a job coach to do some work with that person if they're struggling. Sometimes it might be hiring a mentor to work with them outside of the workplace to help them navigate that. If they're having behavioral challenges, perhaps some mental health counseling or behaviorists to help in those situations. And people make more money generally, typically, when they have some sort of post-secondary education. We're in a state that highly, highly, highly values post-secondary education. That being said, it is not for everyone, and I'm not just referring to post-secondary education as being 2 or 4 year college. There are numerous certification programs out there. Even apprenticeships and things like that can be considered a type of post-secondary education. And there are a variety of other types of education and training that people can take advantage of depending on what they want to do. That's where the career exploration goes into effect. So I'm going to now open it up to questions because we only have a few more minutes left. And I noticed in the chat, and we have one. So Tom, thank you so much. So ODEP, Office of Disability Employment Policy. Thank you. There are so many acronyms that, my mind blanks out on them frequently. So does anyone have any questions about any of the information I shared? There's a lot of slides. I went through it very quickly. Just gonna check on Facebook. Okay. Okay. So question, if a student with an IEP decides to go to college, do they automatically lose transition support from their public high school? So that is a really good question. Thank you. There's a variety of different answers to that. So if a student with an IEP decides to go the traditional route of college, if they graduate with their high school diploma, then yes, they do automatically lose transition support from their public high school. They're considered a student that's exited from district services, and then they would go to the college. We're gonna touch on this. The next webinar is on February 11th from 9 to 10, and it's transition to college. So we will discuss this much more in depth, but they would go to the Office of Disability Services, and they would then determine what accommodations that person would get. There are times when the person does not receive their diploma, and they would perhaps have some support from the public school, even if they are taking college classes. And so those are very individualized situations depending on the needs of the student, but it's not unheard of for a student to be taking a class. Usually I see it at the community college level and still receiving support from the school district. And some community colleges have actual transition programs. So, but definitely join us or watch the recording of the February 11th webinar, because we will go much more in depth into that. All right. And you're welcome. All right, any other questions? Okay. So, there we go. So this presentation, because I had to make it much shorter than I usually do, I didn't show all of the videos, but I do want everybody to be aware that there's this great video series called Skills to Pay the Bills for students. It's a little comical, but it's presented in a very fun way, and it's from the Pacer Center. So I'll post all of these as well. And their employment, they have a lot of employment videos as well with information. And then this is a link to a video called Did You Know 2019, or yeah, Did You Know 2019, that talks about how fast we are moving in the world, and how technology is changing things, and how, I mean, we know this stuff, we hear about it all the time, but this really takes, it's I think about a 7-minute video, 6 or 7 minute video, and it takes all the stats and numbers and puts them into this great video format and talks about how when students start school, by the time they leave school, the jobs have changed so much that we're preparing students for jobs that won't even exist. Some of the jobs may not exist, or may be so different from when they started. This is how quickly things are moving. So it's a really interesting video to watch, and they update it like every other year. So 2019 is the latest. And then some Connecticut resources. So the Department of Aging and Disability Services, formerly DOORS, the Department of Rehabilitation Services. The Bureau of Rehab Services falls under that, so does the Board of Education and Services for the Blind. So you'll find both of those on this website. The Department of Labor has a lot of good information for job seekers. And then I have sent out a link to everybody for our survey and evaluation. So you will have that in your email. So if you could just take a few minutes to do that after the webinar is over. How often do I see BRS working with the districts during the transition process is a question that just came through. It's different in different parts of the state. So BRS is having some capacity challenges right now because they have a lot of new counselors. And so that's not a question that I can just say, it's happening all the time, or it's not, not happening. It's somewhere in between. It really depends on your district. It depends on your area of the state. Different areas of the state have different people that are working, in BRS and working with the school. So my suggestion would be to start with the school. You can always call the BRS office. And if anybody has more questions about that, I am happy to have you call or email me, and I'm happy to talk with you about that further. So we're right at 1 o'clock. I want to thank you all so much for attending and participating in our webinar series. And I hope to see everyone on February 11th. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.